Well, Matthew, thank you for taking the time. Welcome to the show. I was just saying prior to the start here, I started following you about 6 to 8 months ago on Instagram, and I just love your videos. You jump right into kind of the diet wars, if you will, which I try to avoid, but you have the courage to go in and kind of call out some of the somewhat ridiculous things that happen online. So the time you take to do that, and you do it so well and backed up with research, that it's appreciated for people that are really looking for sound advice. So thank you and welcome.
Yeah, no, thanks for the kind words and for obviously following. I mean, that's a part of it is having people who are interested in what you're saying, and try my best to debunk some of the myths and misconceptions out there.
Yeah, and I wanna get into those for sure, and we will get maybe a little diet war esque action going on. But before that, for people that don't know you, I'd love to start with just who you are, what you do, your background, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I grew up. We were just also talking about this prior to starting recording. But I grew up in BC, Canada, originally from Vancouver Island, and then for the last several years in Vancouver itself, or at least around the mainland. The different suburbs and whatnot. And I'm a naturopathic doctor, so I practice in Vancouver. I focus a lot on nutrition counseling, but I also have prescription authority, so I prescribe meds. I do a lot of other treatments and physical therapies as well for injuries and working with athletes and whatnot. So pretty broad range of things that I'm interested in and that I work on. And then of course online, I spend a lot of my time again debunking those myths and misconceptions around nutrition and trying to at least provide people with the info they need to make informed decisions, because I find a lot of the time there's just a lot of echo chambers and people only getting maybe one side of the story, and trying to provide that alternative and hopefully a bit more clear info on kind of where the science stands.
Yeah, that's awesome. And to clarify, your background and your doctorate is a lot more nutrition focused than your average primary care doc or other specialties. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, naturopathic medicine, the thing about it is it can vary a lot between jurisdictions, like what the regulations are, what the scope is, for example. And I'd say here in BC, we have one of the broadest scopes. So there's a lot within that toolkit that we could use, and I do focus a lot on nutrition, which was a big part of my education. Now, of course, there might have been certain things here and there that I would have disagreed with, at least now, that I learned throughout schooling, but it was largely focused on, I'd say, where the evidence stands, with a sort of pro-Mediterranean diet kind of stance on nutrition. And I certainly think that's one of the healthiest dietary patterns out there, but I think there are a number of different ways to go about formulating a healthy diet that generally fall along those sort of principles of plant predominant, unsaturated fats, low in saturated fats, and focus on plant protein as much as possible.
Yeah, and I can see some books in the background of other folks I've had on the show. I see How Not to Die by Michael Greger. I think that's Simon Hill's book back there. So you have landed on, as you were just alluding to a little bit, you personally eat this way, and you have landed on a whole food plant-based diet. How did you land there, and why?
So there's a couple things to clarify. I would say, yes, I eat definitely predominantly whole foods plant-based. I'm 100% plant-based. But I wouldn't say I'm that, pure salt, sugar, oil, free, whole foods, plant-based purist or anything like that, at least at this point. I think where the evidence stands is that we can have unsaturated fat-rich oils regularly within a healthy diet, and they can actually be health-promoting. Salt, something you want to watch, especially if you're eating out frequently, but within certain limits, it's not the worst thing in the world. And same sort of thing with sugar is it really comes down to caloric excess when it comes to sugar. And if you're able to have a little bit within the bounds of where your sort of caloric budget is, that's fine. So I wouldn't say I'm so strictly whole foods in the way that I know some people are. Like, Michael Greger, for example, as you pointed out. I mean, there are certain things that I would disagree with him on. But as far as how I came to it, when I was a teenager, or we'll say even further back, when I was a child, I struggled with weight management. I had asthma that was quite serious at some points, struggled with allergies, some skin issues. And it was actually a personal trainer I had when I was about 15 that pushed more of a plant-based approach and sort of challenged me to adopt some of those recommendations. And eventually, after some pushback, when he wanted me to do a food diary, I actually adopted some of those recommendations as a way to maybe even fool him in a way to think that, hey, this is actually how he eats. He eats pretty well. It's like, no, I kind of changed my diet just for the purposes of this food diary because I knew you were not going to be happy with my diet as it stood. But when I made those changes, I did notice quite a few improvements. I noticed weight was coming off. I noticed my skin was clearing up. I was actually, as far as the asthma, I was breathing a bit better, whether that's due to the weight loss or whether more in fruits and veggies. I mean, who knows? But I was noticing some improvements, and at the time I ascribed them to the diet. And again, whether or not that was purely diet or otherwise, we could debate about that. But that is what ultimately drove my interest into the realm of sort of nutrition and what it could do for us. And over the years, I learned more and more. And there were points that I was on sort of different variations of a plant predominant to plant exclusive diet. And then for the last I want to say almost 14 years now, I've been strictly plant exclusive, vegan, and over time the ethics and environmental factors certainly became important for me as well.
Yeah, there's this idea, and I've heard you debate this a little bit when it comes to if a exclusively plant-based diet is right or optimal. A lot of people think what is the most natural diet would have to produce the best outcomes. And there's this debate between what is natural and what produces the best outcomes. And I've heard you talk about this a little bit, that even if it wasn't the most natural, but it produced the best outcomes, that wouldn't it still be, the better diet for us to follow? So I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So have you seen my debate with Anthony Chafee?
Yes. Is that there was a woman that hosted it, right?
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah. So Anthony Chafee, for people who aren't aware, is I'd say one of the top maybe two most well-known proponents of the carnivore diet at this point. Probably, I think that's fair to say. And so I debated him. It was lengthy, about 2.5 hours. And there was this point where he kept bringing up, well, if you're on a vegan diet, you need to supplement. And it's kind of this idea of like, it's not our natural diet. And so I posed a hypothetical to him. And before I provide this to you, because I think this really hits home why it's important to focus on health outcomes. It took him, I think, 8 times to actually answer the question. He did not want to answer it. And I think it's because this pokes a huge hole in sort of or his ideology, and I'd say a lot of people's view on the matter. So what I said is, let's say there's 2 diets. There's no name, it's not vegan, it's not carnivore, it's nothing like that. There's just 2 diets. Diet A provides most of what you need. We'll say it's not quote unquote natural because you have to take a couple supplements to meet all your nutritional needs. But you live longer, healthier lives, have better overall health outcomes. Now there's Diet B, technically provides everything you need without supplementation, natural, but you live shorter, less healthy lives. And let's say we knew that for a fact. What diet would you choose? Right? It should be a very easy answer, I think, for most people, but he wouldn't answer it. And I had to push him to answer that 8 times. And so, yeah, of course you'd pick Diet A. And what that tells me is that what you ultimately care about are the health outcomes. It's not necessarily, is it natural? Do we need to supplement? That stuff is less important than does it lead to a better, healthier life? And if that's the case, well, then let's dive into the data, the research that we actually have on these dietary patterns, and see what leads to the healthiest life. And what we consistently see is that diets rich in fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, these lead to the best health outcomes, whether that is a plant-exclusive or vegan diet, whether that is even lacto-ovo-vegetarian with modest amounts of, say, some eggs or dairy, Mediterranean, which might even include a bit of meat. These are all associated with similar health outcomes long-term, and they're all quite good compared to those more like red meat heavy diets or diets richer in a lot of the ultra-processed foods, especially sodas and that. So that's what I think we should focus on, is that sort of data.
Yeah, there's this in that debate also. I know you touched on seed oils, or probably he touched on seed oils, I believe, and I have seen this more and more, and I know you've done some great videos on it. And I think it's definitely one of those diet wars topics right now. And even you see RFK hopping into that conversation, and there's a lot of things I love that RFK and kind of that group are doing. I think it's awesome with trying to get chemicals out of our food and everything. But I do think there's this movement at the same time, that calls every, plant-based product, highly processed, and throws it all into this highly processed bucket, and, very much pushes red meat as a health food, and how they sort of explain poor health outcomes on, meat-predominant diets. It feels like they throw it on seed oils as that being like the primary problem in the American diet. So I'd love to get into seed oils a little bit, and some of the data you have seen on it and your take on it.
Yeah, let's first quickly touch on the labeling of ultra processed or highly processed, just because I think that's a quicker topic to get through, and then definitely we'll dive into the seed oil stuff. So with the classification as ultra processed, that classification, at least the typical classification that's used by the NOVA group, does not take into account any health outcome data. It's simply based on sort of the number and types of ingredients and how they're put together. There's a wide range of foods that are classified as ultra processed. Everything from sodas to sausages to whole wheat bread, whole grain breakfast cereals, and pastries. I mean, there's donuts. Those are clearly not the same, and we shouldn't expect all of those to affect our health in the same way. And when we actually look at research that separates out the different types of ultra-processed foods, we see that most of the negative associations are driven by things like processed meats, so sausages, and sugary beverages. Those appear to be the worst of the bunch. Whereas on the other side, things like whole grain breads or whole grain breakfast cereals actually appear to lower risk of a lot of outcomes like cardiovascular disease. So we want to understand, like, where does an individual ultra-processed food lie on that spectrum, not just classify a food as unhealthy simply because it's classified as ultra-processed. It doesn't work that way. Now, yes, you'll see people like RFK Jr. or others point to seed oils as being this villain, but I would ask, like, what evidence are you basing that on? Usually it's a couple specific pieces of evidence. So for one, they'll look at the correlation between when seed oils started to be widely consumed and heart disease rates. And you'll see that at least in the beginning, they did correlate quite tightly. But that's not because people are, dousing their salads in seed oils or, stir frying some veggies in seed oils. It's because ultra-processed foods are comprised largely of seed oils, at least for the fat source. And that would be like saying that water is harmful because it's the main ingredient in Coca-Cola, right? It's the package that's not good. It's having all of this sugar suspended in water that you can, down however many calories and grams of sugar in 30 seconds if you wanted to. That's the problem. And so we have to look at, well, what is the impact of seed oils removed from these packages that they're in? And that's why we look at long-term prospective cohort studies where they'll adjust for diet quality, meaning they'll take people with similar overall diet quality and then look at those eating more seed oils versus those eating less. And when you do that, you actually tend to see reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease, potentially in type 2 diabetes and other outcomes as well. So that is much higher quality data that accounts for the fact that most people are eating more seed oils simply because they're eating more processed foods or ultra-processed foods. Again, yes, different ultra-processed foods are different in the way they affect our health, but generally we're talking about things like potato chips and pastries and whatnot. So that's issue number one. Now the second thing they'll often do is they'll cite a couple specific randomized controlled trials, long-term randomized controlled trials, where it looks like seed oils led to worse outcomes. There's one called the Sydney Diet Heart Study, which we now know the margarine, which was the main seed oil source in that trial, was actually rich in trans fats at the time. But that study was done several decades ago before we knew that trans fats were such a problem. So it's not that the seed oils were bad, it's that the trans fats were harming the people in the trials. And then following that, there's the Minnesota coronary experiment, which is often cited. Similarly, they likely had a margarine at the time with trans fats in it, so that's issue number one. But second, they had a huge dropout rate. Like, they only had data for like a quarter of the participants at 1 year. So most had dropped out or failed to follow up in some way before then. And even then, it wasn't statistically significant. Like, it could go either way. But just with all of those issues and more that we could get into depending on how detailed you want to get, they cast doubt on those findings when we have other randomized trials and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials actually suggesting reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease, with the most impressive trial, in my opinion, being the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. So this was a massive study, something like 850-ish people randomized to one cafeteria or another, and they were living in like a long-term care home. And one cafeteria was rich in saturated animal fats in particular. And then in the other cafeteria, what they actually did was they extracted those saturated fats and infused the foods with seed oils. So they were essentially the same foods, but some of them, the fats were these polyunsaturated fats from seed oils, and the other was more of those saturated fats. And there was dramatic reduction in atherosclerotic cardiovascular events. It was somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 35%, depending on the outcome that you look at, over 8 years, which is huge. Especially for our number one killer in an elderly population. So, wow. Like the data is quite clear that these oils are actually quite healthful.
Yeah, I was having a conversation recently, of somebody who I know eats regularly, meat, dairy, and other processed foods, and they were like giving me a hard time for, the whatever percent oil in my oat milk, that I have in my morning coffee. And I it's just like it's disappointing how things like that get into, mainstream media, and everybody picks it up, and somebody that's eating foods that I just described is concerned about the seed oils in their oat milk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the amounts in the oat milk are it's like a drop, like it's tiny.
It's the least of people's worries.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally just as an emulsifying agent. Like there's no meaningful amount of anything from the oil in there, one way or another. Like I wouldn't claim that I think seed oils are beneficial. I wouldn't claim that the seed oils in oat milk are beneficial because they're in such tiny amounts. Just like I don't understand how you could claim that they're harmful because again, they're in such tiny amounts in there.
Right. Yeah. There's also this idea that, all the studies, especially when it comes to diet and disease prevention, all the studies we have are always compared to the standard American diet. That's another kind of big argument. It feels like that, the studies that we do have that show, the efficacy of a plant-based diet are, taking somebody from the standard American diet, putting them on some type of plant-based diet, and of course you're going to see some sort of positive result. So how do you answer that question? Because, I feel like we're at a time again, and I think there's like this whole RFK thing too, and again, some of it's great, but some of it, like there's this idea that all of nutrition science is like complete bullshit, and should be thrown out the window, and epidemiology doesn't matter. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we definitely have studies comparing plant-based diets to other healthy dietary patterns. So that claim that it's always compared to the standard American diet is just false. I would suggest that someone making that claim, it's sort of clear that they probably haven't really delved into the research on the topic. For diabetes, for example, type 2 diabetes treatment with the plant-based diet, most of the trials we have are actually comparing a plant-based diet to another healthy dietary pattern, whether that's the American Diabetes Association diet, which is largely like a lower carb but relatively whole foods diet, whether that's a portion control sort of diet. We also have studies outside of diabetes now on just cardiometabolic risk factors, comparing, say, a strictly plant-based vegan diet to a Mediterranean diet. And there are certain advantages either way, depending on which marker you're looking at. It's just not true. And then we also have substitution analyses. So these are studies where, again, they'll essentially, in the way that they do the adjustments, they're essentially matching people up based on their diet quality and other factors. So similar exercise, similar smoking habits, and all of that, and similar overall diet quality. But then they're substituting, or at least looking at what would happen if you were to substitute like a single serving, roughly, of red meat with plant protein sources. And even that single substitution, a really modest substitution, will lead to reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease and other outcomes. Or if we look at the swap meat trial, and people hate this one because it's comparing organic and where relevant grass-fed, so like certain animals don't eat grass, but like the ones that do, they were using grass-fed meat, to Beyond Meat products. And two plus servings a day of either product, depending on which group you were in at the time. In the Beyond Meat group, or the Beyond Meat phase, I should say, they saw reductions in LDL cholesterol, small reduction in body weight without any clear negative effects on any of their markers. And so that's, like, I would say that's a pretty fair comparison by most people's standard, this organic, grass-fed, regenerative, whatever you want to call it, meat versus Beyond Meat of all things.
Yeah,
and Beyond Meat still came out on top.
Not even tofu and tempeh, but Beyond Meat. Yeah,
exactly. And so again, this idea that we only have studies comparing to, say, the standard American diet is just false, plain false.
Yeah, I guess on that note, you touched on cholesterol. There's also kind of this theme of, especially kind of in the high meat or carnivore arena, that high cholesterol doesn't necessarily increase your risk for heart disease and other lifestyle diseases. Generally speaking, do you think there's an argument for that? And of course, then you can get into the type of cholesterol, and you can get into calcium, and you can get into ApoB, and you can go further and further. I know there's a lot of nuance there, but when somebody says high cholesterol and high LDL cholesterol is not associated with heart disease, how do you answer that?
Yeah, so if we're talking about LDL cholesterol specifically, there's simply no argument. It's in almost every case. Now, if you want to hone in further on ApoB, so the reason that LDL cholesterol is an issue is because the LDL particles, they contain a lipoprotein called ApoB, and that ApoB, in the simplest way I can explain it, sort of acts as a magnet with compounds within the artery wall. And so it sort of holds it there in what's called the subendothelial space, where it can initiate the progression of a plaque. And so if you have more LDL cholesterol, generally speaking, you have more LDL particles and therefore more ApoB particles. And we know beyond any shadow of a doubt at this point that high concentrations of ApoB cause atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And we know this because we have Mendelian randomization studies. So these are studies where you look at people genetically higher or genetically lower levels, and those with genetically higher levels throughout their whole life, without considering other variables. These are just randomly distributed genetic variants. So it's essentially like a lifelong randomized controlled trial. Those with higher levels have higher risks of cardiovascular disease. We have randomized controlled trials with statins, where statin use lowers cardiovascular disease. We have PCSK9 inhibitors that lower risk. We have bile acid sequestrants that lower risk. So we have a whole host of different medications that all lower risk. Dietary interventions that lower LDL cholesterol also lower risk. And what's most impressive is that each of these interventions lower risk to a predictable degree depending on how much they lower LDL cholesterol. So you see across the board, no matter how it's lowered, if you lower it by a certain amount, you get a certain reduction in risk, approximately, like slight variability, obviously. So in order to claim that LDL cholesterol doesn't matter, you have to somehow explain how all of these medications and diet and genetic variants acting in different ways on your LDL cholesterol all result in the same reduction in risk, depending on how much it lowers LDL cholesterol. Like, it's ridiculous to think that is just by chance, or that it can be explained away. It's unreal. So I see no argument. And we also have studies where you account for things like inflammation and whatnot, and we still see reductions in risk with lowering LDL cholesterol. So yeah, it's complete nonsense.
Yeah, would you say in your experience and in your practice that of all lifestyle changes you can make, is diet the biggest mover?
For LDL specifically?
For LDL and for general health outcomes?
It sort of depends. I mean, I think you could make an argument for for overall endpoints, say long-term outcomes. You could maybe make an argument for exercise. I'd say it's probably similar to overall diet quality. You could give a slight edge one way or another, but for LDL cholesterol, it's no contest that diet trumps exercise, or at least as far as I'm aware, any other lifestyle intervention.
Yeah, I've also seen some videos you've done on the Dave Asprey front, and his latest that I had seen going around was oatmeal, and he's very big on like blood sugar spikes and how that's awful, and he said he'd rather give his kids ice cream than oatmeal for breakfast and things like that. And I think this is something you still hear, this horrible blood sugar spikes. Even when it comes to fruit, people talk about this, and they avoid fruit for that reason, tend to avoid grains for that reason. How do you speak with people on that front?
Yeah, it's a complete misunderstanding of like what these glucose spikes, if you want to call them, are, and what is considered normal. So before getting into it, I would just say anyone who really wants to dive into the topic, I would watch, or listen to, I should say, the Sigma Nutrition podcast with Dr. Nicola Guest. She's phenomenal and really an expert in this area, and I think she does a really good job explaining it. And obviously they spend a full episode talking about this phenomenon, so you're getting into a lot more detail than we will here. So yeah, definitely recommend that, and follow her on Instagram, where she's been putting out little clips talking about it as well. So these acute spikes in blood glucose after eating carbohydrates are fully expected. You eat some carbs, they end up in your bloodstream, your blood sugar goes up a little bit. Normal, expected. Now, what is also normal is that they fall back down to normal range after the meal, and the timeline can vary a little bit, but in someone without significant insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, that's going to happen. Now, where it becomes a problem is if it goes up and it stays up, and that's why people with, say, type 1 diabetes, or people who have been, say, living with type 2 diabetes for a while and they need insulin, why they need to inject insulin to bring it back down, because otherwise it's going to remain elevated. That's going to cause issues. But these acute fluctuations have never been shown to actually lead to worse outcomes in healthier people. I've never seen it. What we ultimately look at is hemoglobin A1C, which is your average blood glucose over time, over about 3 to 4 months. That is a much better marker of how your blood glucose control is, because if you eat some carbs, you're going to see it shoot up, you're going to freak out and maybe choose something else that's not so good. And that's where I think there are some concerns. It's because you'll have people like Dave Asprey or Glucose Goddess or whoever, who will say, oh, you don't want to eat that fruit, or you don't want to eat those whole grains even because of this blood glucose spike, but eat some like meat instead. Well, like red meat intake is associated with type 2 diabetes, the exact mechanisms of which, or if it is causal, I mean, there's some debate around that, but even that aside, you're eating a food that's generally associated with worse health outcomes, but it doesn't spike your blood glucose as much in the short term. So you might look at that on a CGM and think that, oh, I'm doing myself some good, when really in the long term it's probably not so good for you. So I would urge people to avoid falling into those traps. I know it's hard because of the way that they sort of fearmonger about it, but really educate yourself by, again, checking out those resources I mentioned, because I think they'll help settle any nerves there might be around the topic.
The other one I wanted to touch on that I had in my notes here is eggs, and I think maybe there's a few foods that kind of fall into this category. I know red meat is kind of having a comeback at the moment, but I do think there's kind of these in-between debated foods that are, sometimes included in a Mediterranean diet and other diets that are similar. Eggs being one, fish being one, chicken being one. How do you think about those foods when it comes to a healthy diet?
Yeah, let's take them one at a time. So eggs is what you started with. Eggs are sort of tricky, and I feel like they have a really good reputation. Maybe it has flip-flopped a bit over time, but currently I'd say they have a pretty good reputation. But there's a lot of nuance to this topic. So for one, eggs have a little bit of saturated fat, not a ton, but some. But the more, I'd say, debated topic is the fact that it contains a lot of cholesterol. So about 200
Right.
milligrams, just under 200 milligrams per egg, per, I guess, medium-size egg. And so cholesterol affects our blood cholesterol levels, or LDL cholesterol levels, in different ways. So there are a couple factors. One is genetics. Some people are genetic hyperabsorbers. They absorb a lot of it, and that raises their levels. Others are non-responders, so they don't really absorb it at all. So that's one factor that people respond differently. Second, there's a plateau effect. So if you're somebody who eats a more heavy sort of animal-based diet, and or not even necessarily animal-based, but you're eating a fair number of animal foods per day, and you're getting a bunch of cholesterol, you're not really going to see much of an effect from eating more eggs because you can only absorb so much cholesterol at a time. So you'll see people eating animal-based diets, and then, I mean, there was this one example of a guy who, ate a bunch of eggs for a month, and he's like, my cholesterol hardly moved, or it went down. Well, yeah, I mean, you were eating tons of saturated fat and meat and, fatty dairy products, and then you replace some of that with eggs. Like, what do you expect to happen? Because you're already maxed out your cholesterol absorption capacity, and you probably lowered your saturated fat while you're at it. Those are really important variables. But what I like to look at, especially as somebody who's informing the public, is what is the average effect? And we have a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. I believe it was 61 or 66 randomized controlled trials, somewhere in that ballpark, published a few years ago, looking at egg consumption, and an egg a day does increase, on average, LDL cholesterol and ApoB. So on average, we see an effect. Now, if you're replacing meat with eggs, well, that's probably a positive swap as far as heart disease risk goes. But if you're replacing beans with eggs, well, then that's probably a negative swap. You're probably increasing your lipids and possibly your cardiovascular risk. And when we look at studies comparing a wide contrast in egg intake, let's say roughly 0 eggs or close to 0 eggs per week to closer to 1 a day, you actually do see significant differences in risk. But if you're comparing, like the American Egg Board loves to cite this study out of China where it was like 2 versus 4, 2 versus 5 eggs a week, that difference isn't large enough to see a difference in risk. So that's also really important. So yes, they do appear to increase risk, particularly compared to plant protein sources, but can actually lower risk compared to other foods like meats, or especially red meats. So that would cover, I think, eggs pretty well. You mentioned chicken or poultry. They don't tend to be associated with significant increases in risk in most studies, unless, again, you're doing a substitution with plant protein sources. So once again, it kind of depends on what you're comparing it to. And we also have randomized trials showing that compared to plant protein, white meat does seem to increase ApoB levels. The degree isn't, or the degree of like a risk increase isn't as large as we see with red meat typically, but the change in your blood lipids is about the same. So we would expect to see a little bit of an increase in risk there. And then with fish is actually pretty neutral with plant protein sources. It's one of the healthier animal protein sources. So generally speaking, when I'm talking with people who, or patients who are going to continue eating animal products or want to, if they were going to eat some regularly, it would typically be either low-fat dairy or fish that would be amongst the healthiest options. Whereas things like red meat, you'd certainly want to limit. White meat, maybe a little bit more moderate, but that's sort of the I guess scale that I would have for those foods.
There's this idea of kind of like a zone of safety that I think it was 2019 Lancet study, the planetary health plate that they came up with, and they had this idea of like a zone of safety. And it's kind of how I think about diet, where 90% of what I eat is whole food, plant-based as best I can, and then the other 90% I choose to be 100% plant-based, but kind of along the same lines, I might have a beer or two in that 10%. I might have some Beyond Burger. I might have some of the more processed plant-based foods. Do you think that's a good way to look at meat consumption as a whole? That it's kind of this 10% of your diet versus the other way around?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I don't know that I could draw a hard line on a specific number, but I think roughly that 10, maybe even 15-ish% is pretty fair. I would also say that for certain things like the fish or the low-fat dairy, you could probably skew a little bit higher if you were to go that way. But then for the especially processed meats, I would actually skew lower than that range. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there. But generally speaking, yeah, I agree with you. I think, I don't think you can make an argument for a plant-exclusive diet being necessarily healthier than like a 90-95% plant-based diet. But what you do with that extra wiggle room, as you mentioned, is sort of up to you based on your values. And for me, I don't want to contribute to what happens to animals. I am, environmentally conscious to a degree as well. And so when I do want to say indulge in certain things, I'm going to pick the vegan pastry or something like that, right?
Sure.
And that's what I would choose instead of a steak or whatever else you want to throw out there.
Yeah. Is there any research? I know you are constantly reviewing research and data and all the latest papers that come out. Has there been anything that's been published that has made you question kind of where you've landed diet-wise?
No, I would say there are certain little like gray areas or areas where we could use a little more clarity, maybe. Like, so for example, omega-3 supplementation would be one where I wouldn't say I've completely shifted one way or another, but I used to be in the camp that yes, it's super important, we should absolutely be doing it, to now I'm like, I'm not sure. I think that there is conflicting data. I think there are some issues with the studies saying that it is beneficial for just a healthy average adult to be taking, but I wouldn't shy away from it either. I would say as a precautionary measure, it's a decent idea, but I'm not as firm as I used to be on supplementing outside of like pregnancy. I think it's important there. So there are like little details like that I would play around with a little bit, but it wouldn't shift my overall worldview at all, or my overall view on kind of whether a plant-based diet can be healthy at this point.
Yeah, and on the supplementation front, I would imagine recommend B12 for somebody that wants to start a plant-based diet or a predominantly plant-based diet. Is there anything else that you think people should be paying attention to?
I think, so this is a challenging one. I'm actually working on a chapter for a new nutrition textbook that's coming out soon. I'm helping with the plant-based chapter, and we were going through actually this very topic of like supplements. What are we going to do as far as recommendations and where's the data? And it was interesting because a lot of the recommendations that we ended up going with really depend on sort of background diet. So we had to bake in like, if you're not meeting needs this way, then you supplement this, or vice versa. So B12 is the obvious one that pretty much everybody should be taking. You have to be very consistent with fortified food intake otherwise, and I just don't think it's worth stressing over. I mean, you can do a high dose B12 once or twice a week and cost you like $15 a year. that's what mine costs.
Yeah,
like
is that what you would recommend, once or twice a week?
It depends.
You don't need to be doing it daily, you don't think?
So it depends. You can do lower doses daily, and the recommendations do range. 100 micrograms or higher tends to be pretty safe bet. You could go even a little bit lower, but most supplements don't come that low anyway. Or you do a couple times a week at say 2,000 micrograms. Even that is a bit higher than probably necessary, but I like to err on the side of caution and go a bit above just in case. So there's either option. I just think the couple times a week for people who maybe aren't as consistent with their supplementation and cost-wise ends up being better as well. So I like to go that route, but that's up to each individual. And then for other supplements like, vitamin D, it probably depends on where you live, how much sunshine you're getting. Like if you live in Los Angeles and you're outside all the time, I mean, you probably don't have to worry about it. But here in Vancouver, I mean, it's certainly not that nice out today. We don't get a ton of sun from about now until next spring. So yeah, I would supplement vitamin D for the sunlight. If someone wasn't consuming fortified plant-based milks or other fortified products, I'd probably recommend calcium. But I'd say a plant-based milk is a very easy way to get that. And then obviously omega-3s we already touched on. I think it's more of a precautionary measure, but those are really the big ones that I would think of that really stand out. And there are a few other ones we could get into, like actually iodine is maybe one worth mentioning, where if you aren't using an iodized salt, it's probably worth considering as well, because that is the primary iodine source for most people, and a lot of people are skewing towards like Himalayan salts and things like that where they don't have iodine. Yeah, in that case, you might want to consider.
Is iodine in animal products?
It's in some, so it's in like seafood. It's in dairy products, although most of it is added in part because they clean the udders with iodine and kind of gets in there. And so, yeah, so there are certain animal products where you'll get it. There's also certain plant products like seaweeds, but I don't like recommending seaweeds because the iodine content is highly variable. So you don't really know how much you're getting from seaweeds. And for some types of seaweed, you might get too much if you eat them regularly. So I think either just iodized salt, depending on how much is in there, it could be quarter to half a teaspoon a day, really covers your needs, or a supplement if salt isn't an ideal choice.
Yeah, do you think we obsess? I have kind of a theory that we obsess so much about lack and deficiency of some of these things we're talking about, when really we're most of us are constantly in a state of excess and too much of everything. Do you think that's a wrong way to look at things? Like I'm very in my experiences, like I will have like a multivitamin once every 2 weeks type thing. And I just believe like my body is getting everything it needs, or it will tell me otherwise. But at the same time, I'm not like getting blood work every month or anything. So I don't know for sure, but I also eat a lot. I'm an athlete. I eat a ton of food. So I just have this mindset of like, I'm not lacking anything. And like lack and deficiency is not the problem. And even that maybe there's some special sauce in lack, sometimes. And that's why we see, the results we see with fasting and things like that. So I go back and forth on like, if I should pay attention to the B12 and the iodine. I don't pay attention to calcium. That's when I don't. But yeah, what are your thoughts in general of kind of towing that line?
I mean, I think there are certain nutrients, I think I've named most of them here. Maybe you can consider iron, particularly for women as well, but that applies to any dietary pattern. It's not just exclusive to vegan diets. I think it's important to cover those bases that are, I guess, on average an issue or more likely to be an issue than on an omnivorous diet. But don't get me wrong, there are certain nutrients that are more likely to be an issue on an omnivorous diet compared to a vegan diet. Yeah. So there are pros and cons to either. So I think understanding where the possible gaps are and covering those bases is important, but a lot of it can be done pretty easily through diet. Like if you're using salt for cooking, you just use an iodized salt. Don't think about it anymore. If you're having a couple cups of a fortified plant-based milk a day, whether that's in lattes or your smoothies or whatever, cool. Don't have to worry about calcium anymore. And then you take a B12 supplement and maybe vitamin D, depending on where you live, and you're pretty well covered for some of the main nutrients I would be concerned about. At the same time, I also think a simple multivitamin is a really easy way to cover your bases without having to think too much. I'm taking it more than once every couple of weeks, of course, but if you're taking it more regularly, daily, ideally, then you just don't have to think much about it. Otherwise, it's sort of that safety net, or that I would consider it more of a safety net than anything, and versus, say, not thinking about it at all. Because I think there's potential for deficiencies to arise over time. There certainly is for things like vitamin B12. And I'd rather not have people run into those issues down the road when they could have so easily been prevented in the first place. So I think there's a line between over obsessing about it and just doing a few simple things to cover your bases.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have a practice in Vancouver. I don't remember if you mentioned that at the beginning or not, but you do. I would imagine you get a lot of people that have health issues or are overweight that are coming to you for solutions. And I guess I don't want to focus on that clientele, but maybe more so the people like you and I who are relatively healthy, that are maybe trying to do things to stay on top of all these numbers and all this data we can now get on ourselves. what do you think is kind of like if you could tell somebody, here's what you should do, X amount of times per year, whether it be, blood work and DEXA scan, and all these new tools we have, like what would be like the perfect program in your eyes?
So that will depend a lot on risk factors or clinical picture. Like, for example, DEXA scans, I mean, it's nice for personal interest. I've done it myself just to see, like, where's my bone density, where's my visceral fat and all of that, which for the carnivores who keep asking me was very low, one of the lowest they'd ever seen for the visceral fat in particular.
I have a good story about DEXA scans too, with my meat eating friends, but
yeah. And anyways, but for someone, especially in postmenopause, who might be at risk of osteoporosis, I mean, that could be a good thing to help track bone mineral density, and there are guidelines around that. So I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all. What I would say, and I think this is a really good idea for people to do younger than later in life, is to measure lipids like the LDL cholesterol, or if possible ApoB. And also lipoprotein a, or Lp(a), which is a genetically determined marker that also increases cardiovascular risk. Now that one only has to be tested once ever because it doesn't really change too much. But the ApoB can be used to monitor risk, and I would say that if you catch an elevated ApoB or LDL cholesterol earlier in life and you treat it earlier, you can have a dramatic effect on your cardiovascular risk later in life. And right now, depending on risk factors, guidelines recommend either testing at age 40 or 50. But I have patients coming in, who are in their 50s at this point. They've never tested it, and that's worrisome because once in a while I'll do those labs with them and we'll catch like a really high number, and it's like, man, you've been living with that for 5 decades now, and you've accumulated all this plaque, and now you're at an elevated risk, and we can't necessarily undo all of that, but we can hopefully slow progression moving forward. So if you catch things like that earlier in life and you deal with it earlier in life, you can really improve your cardiovascular risk moving forward. So that's something that I do recommend testing. And as far as other markers, it just depends on clinical picture, what would be important at the time.
Yeah, and would you say annually or more frequently than that?
Oh, no, you definitely, unless you're initiating treatment and you want to monitor the progression, at least at the beginning, you don't really have to do more frequently than that. I mean, again, guidelines depending on if we're looking at cardiovascular markers, if we're looking at blood glucose related markers, you're looking at every 3 to 5 years typically, as per guidelines here in Canada. I don't know if the US is a little bit different on that, but again, that will vary depending on what the results show and sort of your other risk profile. If you're at higher risk for things like the diabetes markers, you'll check them yearly. So it's hard to prescribe like a specific timeline for the testing.
Yeah, and I imagine you do prescribe exercise to people, or is there, when it comes to that, and again maybe focusing on a healthier individual who's trying to prevent disease and extend health span, do you have recommendations or thoughts on weight training versus zone 2 training versus like the mix you should have across your exercise regimen?
Yeah, so if we're taking somebody who's never really done too much training, especially resistance training, I like to recommend at least once, ideally twice a week for resistance training. Once a week seems to be where we see the largest decrease in cardiovascular risk, again, moving from 0 to 1. If you move beyond once a week, you don't see too much of a reduction. I mean, it doesn't go up, so you're at least staying at plateau. But also, if you have a couple times a week as far as like actual muscle and strength progression, you're going to see a lot better results than just once. And then for more of the aerobic training, I do like 2 to 3 times a week. Again, just based on the data we have on cardiovascular risk reduction, about 3 times a week seems to be ideal. I mean, you can go beyond that and further reduce risk a bit as well. But that difference between 0 to 2, even into 3, you see a pretty substantial reduction in risk. So that's what I would suggest for someone without honing in on things like, zone 2, zone 5, all of that. I think just getting into that sort of activity. And then, of course, if you're looking to maximize VO2 max, we can get into zone 2 training. We can do some HIIT like zone 5 training. But I think that's down the road stuff. Like that's not something that I would just throw out to the average patient that I have.
Yeah, I've seen you do a few Peter Attia related clips, and he's very big on VO2 max and how that correlates to health span. And do you have a similar sentiment, or do you think that's not as important as is kind of being pushed right now?
So it associates well with good health outcomes for sure, and I'm not surprised by that. I mean, it's a marker of fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness. Sure. It should correlate well with good health outcomes. The concern is when you look at a lot of the studies on VO2 max, or even just exercise in general, a lot of the times they don't really consider diet quality. There are some studies now that do, at least for exercise as a whole. And so you also have to wonder, like, how much is that confounded by things like exercise? Is there some potential reverse causality in a way that people who get sicker are less likely to exercise, and then their say VO2 max declines versus things like or versus the VO2 max being the causal agent there? I think it's a good marker for cardiorespiratory health. I think it's a good marker for longevity overall, but I don't know that I would be so strong in sort of the claims that I make around it as being this like all-important marker over some of the other markers that we have, or I know Attia is not the biggest on a lot of the diet or nutrition research out there either, but I would say, I mean, we could possibly argue that diet quality is as important, if not more important, as well.
Yeah, because kind of like the counter to that is, sort of the blue zone kind of lifestyle of, none of them are doing, high intensity training or, zone 2 training. They're just moving throughout their day. And, that seems to be enough if you're eating the right foods to kind of cover your bases.
Well, I would say at least for the respective cohorts we have on like exercise, like I said, it's not crazy amounts, it's not necessarily super high intensity, but I would say that there has been some serious pushback on some of the blue zones stuff recently around like death certificate, or not death certificates, I think it was birth certificates or things like the ages.
Really?
Yeah, like there's some concerns around some of the age reporting and stuff. I haven't read too much into it. I remember some of the reports were going around, and I read some of the content on the topic, but I haven't really delved into the primary sources yet anyway. So I would say that I'm a little more hesitant to cite blue zones for anything. I mean, I already wasn't citing it really that often, but even more so hesitant now.
Interesting. The Sardinians are fudging their birth certificates over there.
I can't recall the exact details, but something like that.
I'll have to look into that. Is there any other topic that seems to come up regularly, especially with kind of the big influencers online and things that drives you nuts that we haven't really touched on?
I think by far the biggest one is probably the whole animal versus plant protein debate. I don't think there's anything that comes up as often as that. I feel like I make posts on that every almost couple weeks now.
And just the idea that plant protein's incomplete protein, you can't build muscle the same way, you'll die without animal protein, that sentiment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And like, I mean, for one, on the idea that plant proteins are incomplete, well, plant foods in general contain all the 9 essential amino acids, all the 20 dietary amino acids, just in varying amounts. So they aren't truly incomplete. People sort of use this like made up definition for a complete protein. What's funny is the only food I'm aware of that is completely lacking an essential amino acid is actually collagen or gelatin. One is the derivative of the other. And it's lacking tryptophan, so it's like an animal product is actually an incomplete protein. But when you eat a diet comprised of more than a single food group, which I hope that everyone does, you don't really have an issue with it, provided you're eating enough protein. Now, so that covers the amino acid, or the incompleteness rather, the amino acid profile. The second thing that comes up is digestibility, and people will sort of misuse the measures of digestibility that we have, and Atia is actually one of the people that I've seen do this, is they'll cite these, either the PDCAS or the DIAS score, and these are measures of digestibility, but what they don't seem to understand is it's not just a measure of digestibility. So if you had a protein, let's say a plant protein source that met your needs as a single food, met your needs for most of the essential amino acids, but maybe it was a bit lower in one of them. Let's say it provided on its own 50% of your needs for that one amino acid. And let's say it was 80% digestible. Well, 80% of 50% would be 40%, right? That, now I'm making up numbers here, but that protein would get a score of 40%. Even though the protein was 80% digestible, it will get a score of 40%. Then you'll have people like Atia, Dave Asprey, Saladino, all these people say, even Lane Norton says this, which as a protein researcher, I would hope he understood this. But they would say that you don't absorb like 60% of that protein, which is just not true. You're absorbing 80% of it. And when you combine that with another protein source, that number is going to go way up because you're now completing that sort of amino acid profile or meeting all your needs. So that would be the other big issue. But at the end of the day, what we care about are the health outcomes. Like what actually happens over time to, say, muscle and strength gains if you eat plant protein instead of animal protein. And we have multiple trials comparing these now either to a plant exclusive or very nearly plant exclusive diet. And both the omnivores and the vegans or predominantly plant-based individuals end up having the same muscle and strength gains, like with no clear differences in any measure. And so if you get the same result at the end of the day, clearly these so-called differences in digestibility aren't a big concern.
Yeah, I loved Simon when I had Simon on, his answer to that question, in him describing that once protein is broken down in your body to amino acids, your body doesn't know if that amino acid came from an animal food or a plant food. Like it doesn't care. And it doesn't matter at that point. And I just loved kind of that framing of it. Well, Matthew, unless you have anything else, I know I've taken an hour of your time, and this has been awesome. I next time, hopefully, if there's a next time, maybe we can focus in, more intently on one topic. I know I threw a ton at you, but I think they're kind of the things that people are asking all the time and are confused about all the time. So I had a long list of things I wanted to cover, but maybe next time we can pick a single topic and get a little more in depth. But give everybody listening, where is your practice? Where can people follow you? How can people work with you? All that good stuff.
Yeah, so my practice is on Commercial Drive in Vancouver. I do see patients locally here in Vancouver as well as across British Columbia through like online video appointments. So if you have any questions, you can always DM me or send an email. So the email is on my website, drmatthewnagra.com, and you can follow me on Instagram and all other social media platforms at dr.matthewnagra. And of course, like I said, you can DM me there if you have questions as well. And I have a couple, I'd say, exciting things coming up soon, and we'll say the next few months. I can't say too much about them yet, but if you follow along, you'll see them shortly.
We'll be keeping an eye out. Awesome. Well, thank you again for all the work you do. Truly, like it's great to see. I know how it gets online, but it's great to have someone like you who takes the time to respond to some of the crazy things we see out there. So thanks for all you do.
Perfect. Thanks. And yeah, thanks for having me on. And hopefully we can do it again and dive into the nitty-gritty details of some of these topics.
For sure. Thanks, Matt.